Hello lovelies, and welcome back to another episode from the Halcyon Heights server. Last time, we worked on the corrupted forest and the house for the mythical entity that lives deep within. Yes, I have still not decided exactly what she will be. Maybe I don't have to. Maybe she, or he, can be many things all at once, depending on who is telling the story. I kinda like that. And no, not because it gets me out of making a decision. Anyway, between episodes, I expanded the corruption a bit beyond the borders of the wall and was able to get my hands on some of the eye blossoms, which we have scattered around the area. I have also started to level off the terrain here in the cherry grove for a future project. But before we jump into something new, we have other things that we need to complete. As I said in the last episode, I want to finish up with this farming area here on the western side. This includes building the 4 peasant houses whose locations are currently indicated by the pumpkin outlines, and filling in the surrounding areas with crops and other vegetation. Now, if you've been here before, you may know that most of my builds, if not inspired by something specific, requires me to have at least a vague idea in my head before I can start. And currently, I am totally idea and inspirationless with regards to these peasant houses. So I am actually going to start with the crops and some of the other vegetation in hopes that as I work on that, something sparks my imagination. First, although I don't know what I want the houses to look like, I do know that I want to have a small area around each one for a yard or other vegetation that is not part of the crops. So let's lay out markers around each of these pumpkin squares to indicate where those areas will likely be. Okay, now that we have those areas laid out, let's figure out our crops. First, we have this giant wheat field over there. I have been happy with the extent of this field, as it has more or less been this size since we planted it so long ago. But as I was thinking of what I wanted to put in certain areas, I imagined the field actually extending in behind the windmill, and possibly a bit further. And suddenly, this became exactly what needed to be done. What have I said about me being led by inspiration? Well, since this is now the only thing on my mind, let's start there and see where things take us. By expanding the wheat field around the windmill, this meant that the current entrance to the wheat field would become obsolete. Therefore, the first thing that I did was figure out where the path would run through the extension and where the new entrance to the wheat field would now be. This took me quite some time to figure out, as I was having difficulties picturing a new configuration of the paths that would make sense. Originally, I thought that I would just follow the paths that were already there, but it didn't really make any sense. So I ended up cutting out a section of the path and connecting the existing wheat field path to that which was behind the blacksmith. With the new pathway in place, I then turned my attention to expanding the wheat field itself. I decided to leave the trees that were behind the windmill where they were for no particular reason other than I thought that it'd be fun to have some trees growing in the middle of the field. So here we have the finished product. I am happy with how the pathway turned out, and overall it already feels much more natural. We now have an entrance to the field and windmill area itself over here, and another one over behind the blacksmith. I also came in afterwards and filled in the spaces in front of the windmill with some wild vegetation. Before I thought of expanding the wheat field, I genuinely had no idea what I was going to do to decorate this space. But now that it's done, it feels like it has always been like this. And now back to the houses. I thought that the monotony of planting all the wheat in the field expansion would allow my mind to wander and come up with a design for the peasant houses, but alas, that was not the case. So after a short Google session, I found a really cute inspiration picture that is actually very much like the build palette that we've been using everywhere else. So let's dive right in. The houses are going to be very simple with a stone base, white walls, thatched roof made of likely moss, a fireplace and chimney protruding out the back, and wooden details much like the other builds. Given that these houses are for some of the poorest people in the kingdom, I think we will make at least one of them show signs of significant decay or neglect that they have not been able to fix. There we have it, our first house. As planned, we have a simple deep slate base that shows various stages of wear and deep slate details on the walls and roof. For the walls, I decided to only use stripped pale oak logs, pale oak planks, and mushroom stems. The calcite seemed too upscale for these houses, and the bone blocks didn't really match how I wanted them to. I decided to make the roof out of the pale moss and mushroom stems, with some of it spilling over the eaves. With the chimney in the back, we have a nice cozy little house. Now only 3 more to go. And since they will more or less be all the same, let's cut to a time lapse. There we go. All 4 peasant houses are now done. All of them have the exact same structure, but some variation was introduced in the details and placement of the chimneys. The insides are still a bit sparse, but I have put in a floor that is meant to mimic a straw floor, and there is a cauldron hanging over each of the hearths. I will come back in the future and put in some more furniture. For now, the next step is to expand the other crops. Starting out, I wasn't exactly sure which crops I wanted to plant and where. I knew that I wanted more potatoes and carrots since that was what I already had planted in around the compound, but I was still unsure about beetroot. So while I pondered, I started out by dividing up the green areas into more manageable garden sections. In the new sections near the compound and over by the blacksmith, I planted more potatoes and carrots, while finally in the central sections, I decided that I would add some beetroot. With the fields finished, our last thing to do was to figure out what to do with the hill area. I had been unsure what to do with this space for quite a while. If you remember, there was talk of putting a stables up on the hill, but that didn't really make any sense. I did know that I wanted some aesthetic melons and pumpkins both on the hill and near the compound, so I started out with those. And then it was a slow process of trying to visualize what I wanted to put next and where. This took about 6 hours over the course of a couple days because since I didn't have any grand idea for the area, it came to me in bits and pieces, and I had to take many breaks to be able to come back and look at it with fresh eyes. And sometimes I just had to stare at it forever before another piece of the puzzle would pop into my head. Overall, although this is not what I had thought the area would look like, I am extremely pleased with how this all came out. Once I was finished with the hill, I went back in and filled in some other areas around the houses and the lake. I was very committed to all the little details, so much so that I even watched bamboo grow so I could put the string on for the height that I wanted. And there we have it, the mostly complete west side. There are still a few things that we need to add, like the hermit living over near the wheat field, and interiors to most of the buildings. But overall, this part of the kingdom is done, even up on top of the hill here. While working on the hill vegetation, the top of the hill increasingly became the perfect spot for a secluded lake, so I added that in as well. I am so happy with how all this has come together, and it looks like it has always been here. Lore-wise, I feel like this forest lends reason for all the use of spruce throughout the base. I can imagine that the entire farming area was originally covered in spruce that they cleared away to make room for crops. However, once they got to the rocky terrain of the hill, they determined that it was not really suitable for crops and therefore left the forest, installing only a couple of stairways where they could to allow for access up the steep terrain. Although this episode is a bit on the shorter side, we certainly accomplished a lot. Next time, we will move east in the kingdom and start work on a 3-tiered lake that we have outlined over behind the cathedral. So until then, stay floofy my friends, and I will see you sometime in the future. Bye!